deepest respect for human rights as a precondition for peace and security. The very existence of the United Nations is based on the imperative to protect peace, human rights, and justice, to ensure stability and social progress globally. Lithuania finds the Council of Human Rights to be of great importance for enhancing cooperation and promoting human rights. It inspires us to work on protecting human rights, identifying vulnerabilities, and addressing them. I disagree with those who say that we must focus merely on the implementation of human rights norms. There are too many people now who cannot enjoy their rights because of new challenges or emerging protection gaps. Nobody should be left behind. Human rights are universal, indivisible, and inherent to every human being. It's unfortunately true that we are being routinely confronted with violations of human rights in many places of the world. There are a few words to be said about the current situation in Lithuania's immediate neighborhood. More than 6 months have passed since the fraudulent presidential election in our neighboring country. All this time, security forces have been applying brutal mass violence against peaceful protesters, political opposition, civil society journalists, and media workers. Such brutalities should be addressed by international organizations. Investigations of the violations of human rights must be carried out. Accountability mechanisms for the human rights violations must be elaborated. We are also taking note of many recent human rights violations. The poisoning attempt and subsequent incarceration of and trial of Alexei Navalny, the politically motivated trial against human rights defender and historian Yuri Dmitriev, and many other examples paint a rather grim picture. To this, we should also add actions ongoing in the illegally annexed Crimea, in non-government-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine, as well as in the occupied Georgia's regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Lithuania calls to end systematic violations of the international law and to cooperate with the United Nations mechanism. There are always those who attempt to defend these actions, talking about matters of supposedly purely internal or domestic concern. However, it should be clear that there is no way to selectively apply the human rights doctrine. Our duty calls on us to ensure that all victims get effective protection and redress. All perpetrators must be brought to justice. Let me assure you that Lithuania will always support a strong human rights pillar of the United Nations. We participate eagerly in all the efforts to sustain the freedom of peaceful assembly and association worldwide. In 2014-2015, while acting as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, Lithuania had spoken out for media freedom and protection of civilians in armed conflicts. We also promoted the rule of law, as well as gender equality and women empowerment. Currently, my country is running for a seat on the Human Rights Council in 2022-24. If elected, Lithuania will give attention to the promotion of rights of those most vulnerable, children, people with disabilities, human rights defenders, and people living in conflict situations. We will also continue our ongoing activities in the promotion of the rights of the women and girls, the safety of journalists, freedoms of expression, as well as of assembly and association, freedom of religion and belief, and the inclusion of civil society in the Council's agenda. Lithuania will seek that this Council makes a real difference on the ground. We are also determined to research for solutions that would be acceptable to all parties involved. To support human rights worldwide, we will also need broad cooperation. The recent decision made by the United States of America to rejoin the Council as an observer with the intention to seek full membership is therefore a welcome development. As the current chair of the executive board of the UNICEF, Lithuania is also keen to work that no child is left behind. Empowering children by ensuring equal access to quality education is a key element of good future for the whole of humanity. We should also pay close attention to persons with disabilities, who often face multiple forms of discrimination. There should be strong efforts to take steps in adjusting our policies and raising awareness. Our main goal is to address the needs of persons with disabilities, achieving their full social integration. Lithuania will also continue to support human rights defenders, for we strongly believe that their activities are the cornerstone of free and democratic societies. There are too many disturbing instances of killings, death threats, and other forms of intimidation against human rights defenders. All governments should live up to their moral and legal obligation to prevent such crimes. To protect the rights of the people living in conflict areas, we need viable political solutions addressing the root causes of a specific conflict. The international community has a crucial role to play in mediating, negotiating, and implementing peaceful agreements. Finally, the biggest challenge, in my opinion, will be to strengthen the rule of law on a global scale. Without it, the human rights regime could always fall prey to dangerous destabilization and erosion. So let us work together, promote the rule of law, and build a better future for all people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Mohammad Ashraf Ghani, President of Afghanistan. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
In the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful, Madam President Nizhat Shamim Khan, Your Excellency Ambassador Volkan Bozkır, President of the General Assembly, Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, Excellency Madame Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I'd like to congratulate you, Madam President, for assuming the presidency of the 15th cycle of the Human Rights Council and wish you and the Bureau a successful year ahead. It is an honor to address the Human Rights Council to reaffirm Afghanistan's unwavering commitment to protect, promote, and fulfill human rights and fundamental freedoms, as well as our unequivocal support to the noble mandate of the Council, the UN human rights mechanisms, and the activities of the Office of the High Commissioner for human rights. We, the people of the United Nations, meet in the context of unprecedented global turbulence. COVID-19, the changing nature of violence and war, climate change, the fourth industrial revolution, and transformation of technology and the explosion of inequality each constitute a distinctive form of disruptive change. Their simultaneous occurrence and entangled interactions produce a hyperphenomenon, marking a break between our assumptions, routines, and habits of the past. Confronting our collective global challenge requires a global review, similar to the imagination and cooperation that give us the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations, and the Bretton Woods institutions. The scale and scope of the challenges facing our interconnected world bear on every article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, requiring review and restatement. The question is not the enduring relevance of the vision, but issues arising from success and the radical change in context. Human rights are almost universally accepted, as reflected in the constitutions of most of the countries of the world. Respecting may be a different matter, reflecting the degree to which the processes of state building and market building have been citizen-focused and rights-based. The challenge now is renewal of global consensus on moving from the discourse of human rights to the practice of human rights. Hence, the urgency of exploring the impact of the 5 drivers of global turbulence in relation to renewal of commitment to the preamble that the recognition of the inherent dignity of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. The foundational right for us, the Afghan people in government, is the right to peace. Subject to 40 years of violence, the right that we yearn for most is the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person within a sovereign, democratic, and united country. The toll on our livelihood and lives has been immense. The World Bank estimated the material loss between 1978 and 2001 at $240 billion. The human loss is commonly estimated at 1.5 million killed, 2 million internally displaced, and 9 million forced to become refugees. The scale and scope of our suffering continues. The Global Terrorism Index, to take one example, estimates the damage inflicted by the Taliban on our GDP in 2019 at 18.6%. Afghan refugees still living in Iran and Pakistan are estimated at 5 million respectively. The number of disabled is 152,000 and internally displaced at 400,000. Mere numbers do not capture the extent of our tragedy. The recent wave of violence against our people, civil and civic institutions, from human rights and civil society organizations to the media, judicial, civil service, and security organizations to farmers and traders are indications of a systematic onslaught against our society. Targeted killings are the sharp edge directed against men and women, representing the profound transformation our society during the last 20 years. Its issue is not just the continuous nature of violence inflicted upon us during the past 40 years. Even worse is the phenomena of unrestricted warfare. Colonels Xiao Liang and Wang Jiangshu argued in 1999 that warfare will soon, I quote, transcend all boundaries and limits. The battlefield would be everywhere, and the boundaries lying between the two worlds of war and non-war, of military and non-military, will be totally destroyed, end of quote. Tragically, their prediction has become a reality. We, the people of Afghanistan, suffer on a daily basis from the effects of unrestricted warfare. What becomes of the promise of Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Clearly, the institution of post-World War II, if proven inadequate to preventing the recurrence of the barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. The answer, however, surely does not lie in discarding the universal acceptance of human rights. As Rosa Brooks argues, the best route to upholding human rights and the rule of law lies in recognizing that war and peace are not binary opposites, but lie along a continuum. We can accept the word as it is, but change the categories we use to make sense of it and develop new rules and institutions to manage the paradox of perpetual war. When we developed our first constitution in 1923, we were the only fully sovereign country in the Muslim world. The discourse of rights and obligations enshrined in our first constitution was developed by a remarkable group of scholars from Afghanistan, India, and the Ottoman Empire, reflecting a century of state building within the dominant norms of Islamic thought and practice. Our current constitution of 2004, enshrining a clear commitment to the principles of human rights, respect both for the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, builds on the cultural foundations of our first constitution and our Islamic beliefs, culture, and civilization. The rights of citizens articulated in Chapter 2 of our Constitution are not moral injunctions, but fundamental rights constituting the constitutive and regulative rules of the state, society, and economy in the interrelations and check and balances of three branches of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Despite the intensity of violence, Afghan citizens, men and women, girls and boys, old and young, rural and urban, religious scholars and civil society activists have found common ground in the categories of citizenship in the Republic as enshrined in the Constitution. Accountability for, adherence to, and respect for human rights, therefore, is not grounded in responding to external pressures, but flow from a rich and lively set of agreements and disagreements among equal citizens, making our history and attempting to secure our future through overcoming our tragic past. I'll spare you the numbers, as the UNAMA reports both document our efforts and our challenges. I can, however, categorically state that the majority of our citizens, fully 70.6% of whom are under the age of 30, are now not only familiar with the notions of fundamental rights, but frame their dialogue and demands from their government as citizens empowered by the Constitution. Achieving peace is our national quest. There's a national consensus on the end state of a sovereign, democratic, united Afghanistan. At peace within and with the world, incapable of preserving and expanding the achievements of the past 20 years. We are in a historically rare moment when a just and lasting peace can be achieved through a political settlement. The Afghan people and the government have the commitment, conviction, and courage to demonstrate the sense of urgency required in such an open moment. Difficult choices will have to be made to move from being a battlefield of unrestricted warfare to a platform of an Asian roundabout and international cooperation. Human rights, in general, and rights of citizens, women, girls, youth, and social categories, in particular, are going to figure prominently in the peace negotiations. What would be the advice of the human rights community and the stand of the Human Rights Council? We ask for your early engagement and constructive partnership to secure for a generation of Afghans bearing the scars of war and the future generations that can enjoy the rights of peace. If war and peace constitute a continuum today, surely moving from the purgatory of unrestricted warfare to lasting peace is worth the marshalling of all of our collective energies and imagination. We, the Afghan people and government, are placing our peacemaking efforts within a framework of international and regional partnerships around the aligned processes of state building, market building, and state building to reinforce our shared destiny as a unified nation. The Independent Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan is a constitution-based national human rights institution, fully and robustly functioning according to the Paris Principles. It has consistently maintained its A status rating. The government of Afghanistan fully respects and cherishes the independence and impartial conduct of our National Human Rights Commission, when we are committed to increase our financial contribution without restrictions. Finally, Madam President, in the last 3 years, as a member of this Council, Afghanistan improved and enhanced cooperation with the international human rights mechanisms. We paid serious attention to our commitments and pledges made during our candidacy. Under my direct instructions, the government of Afghanistan submitted 6 initial and periodic reports on the implementation of core human rights conventions, some overdue since Afghanistan first acceded to them decades ago. We also presented our 3rd cycle UPR report, and we are tirelessly working towards the implementation of the recommendations received during the review. Afghanistan will continue to closely cooperate with the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mechanism. As a Council member, we prioritize the areas where a significant protection and global attention gap existed and contributed to filling the gap, including the rights of migrants and asylum seekers. Using experiences from this very first term, Afghanistan is willing and committed to serve and continue to build on its legacy of constructive engagement as a member for another term in 2023-25, for which we seek your support and cooperation. Excellencies, distinguished participants, at the end, once again, let me thank you for the opportunity. At a moment in history where the combined impact of disruptive forces puts into question the near universal acceptance of human rights, we need to work together to preserve the gains of the past by taking account of the changed context and offer updated rule of law in human rights frameworks that can result in furthering the promotion of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Afghanistan will be a steady partner in this journey of faith and imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Andrzej Duda, President of Poland. Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to address the Human Rights Council. Let me begin by congratulating Her Excellency Ambassador Nazet Shemin-Khan of Fiji to her appointment as President of the Human Rights Council. Madam, I wish you every success in steering the Council. I would also like to commend the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Madame Michelle Bachelet, and her office for their dedication to advance the human rights standards. Let me assure you, Madam High Commissioner, that in Poland you have a strong ally and a dedicated partner. Excellencies, the times we are navigating through are challenging. The situation of human rights is not getting better. On the contrary, a lot needs to be done. The spread of COVID-19 and our attempts to contain the virus is the most pressing challenge to the international community. The pandemic has shown that no society or country, poor or rich, and no part of the world is immune to its negative impact and spillover effects. But the consequences of the pandemic are even more serious. First, COVID-19 has raised the issue of healthcare, public health and health security to the level of basic human rights. Second, we cannot allow for the pandemic to contribute to an even greater exclusions in the world, to a division between rich and poor. And last but not least, the fact that for more than a year now, most of the attention has been paid to combating COVID-19 does not mean that other problems have magically disappeared. Quite the opposite. The situation in many parts of the world keeps worsening as we speak. Today, I would like to concentrate on a few most urgent issues. As a head of the state located in Central Europe, I want to draw your attention to the situation in countries that border my country, Poland, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. It must be underlined that following presidential elections in their homeland, thousands of Belarusians took to the streets to exercise their basic democratic rights. The scale of repressions of the Belarusian regime that followed was more than alarming. In that regard, the international community cannot remain silent. Every country has to fulfill its obligations under the international human rights law. I call on the Belarusian authorities to move away from the policy of oppression to the policy of dialogue. Sadly, Belarus is not the only country in our region whose authorities follow a path of political repression against its society. This has been clearly presented by the Russian Federation in massive detentions of peaceful protesters who had gathered to express their support for Alexei Navalny and his co-workers. They are not known by their names, and their fate remains unknown in many cases, but we can judge from experience that it might be tragic. Restoration of the business-as-usual approach to Russia and expecting it would influence the Kremlin's behavior is naive. It's not what proper dialogue means. Proper dialogue implies that certain standards have to be upheld. And in the case of Russia, these standards are not improving. They are deteriorating. I call upon the Russian authorities to realize its international obligations and therefore release Alexei Navalny and his detained supporters. The international community should also continue paying close attention to the dire situation of human rights in the territories of Ukraine being under control of Russian occupation forces or Russia-backed separatists. Poland clearly reconfirms its support for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine within the internationally recognized borders. Esteemed colleagues, turning to the religious persecution, it has to be stressed that freedom of religion or belief is one of the basic human rights and needs to be protected worldwide. The violation of this fundamental right should be addressed by the international community more efficiently. Poland has been particularly concerned by the increasing phenomenon of discrimination against and religious persecution of Christians and other religious minorities. As a result, on August 22nd, 2019, on Poland's initiative, the General Assembly adopted the resolution titled International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. Poland also remains committed to protecting vulnerable groups, including children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. We must stand up for those who will not be able to stand up for themselves. We must strive for solidarity. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom of expression is the last issue I would like to highlight today. It being referred to as the first freedom, we must make sure that in the area of digital revolution, it remains so. Therefore, The task ahead of us is to build an open public sphere in the digital domain. Excellencies, to conclude, I want to assure you that as a member of the Human Rights Council, Poland will continue the mission it started during the membership in the UN Security Council. We seek a world based on the force of law and not the law of force. And we will engage with all stakeholders who share our vision. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Nicolás Maduro Moros, President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Gracias, Presidenta. Asisto en esta oportunidad con beneplácito y en nombre del pueblo de Venezuela a esta importante sesión del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Las graves e inesperadas circunstancias del COVID-19 que enfrenta la humanidad exigen de los líderes mundiales mayor compromiso en el trabajo por un destino mejor, común y compartido. La pandemia del COVID-19 ha cobrado la vida de 2.400.000 personas y ha infectado a más de 109 millones en el mundo, exacerbando las injusticias y desigualdades sociales. Una emergencia de tal magnitud ha puesto en evidencia la necesidad de asumir la salud como un derecho humano fundamental. El multilateralismo está demostrando que es la única vía posible para superar las dificultades globales y construir mejores condiciones de vida para los pueblos. En este sentido, queremos reconocer el trabajo orientador de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, que ha logrado las coordinaciones entre los estados para evitar una tragedia aún mayor. Venezuela, por su parte, ha logrado mitigar y controlar la pandemia gracias a una política social preexistente de salud pública, gratuita y de calidad, de seguridad social y a la implementación de metodologías de bioseguridad fundamentadas en la participación ciudadana, así como en la aplicación de tratamientos científicos complementarios y combinados que ponemos a la orden de los Estados miembros con la mayor humildad. No ha sido fácil. Nuestra patria enfrenta una guerra multidimensional, orientada a acabar con el modelo social inclusivo construido por la Revolución Bolivariana. Acciones de presión desmedida, de persecución contra nuestro país, a través de la imposición de más de 450 medidas coercitivas, unilaterales e ilegales, que han resultado en un bloqueo y una obsesiva persecución contra las capacidades del Estado y de la sociedad venezolana. Por medio de las mal llamadas sanciones, Venezuela ha sido privada de al menos 30.000 millones de dólares en efectivo, que forma parte de los activos de la República en el exterior, recursos que debieron y deben ser utilizados para atender la salud, la alimentación y los derechos integrales de nuestro pueblo. Los secuestradores de los activos y recursos del Estado venezolano han demostrado una gran crueldad, incluso en circunstancias de pandemia, destacando y desacatando los llamados de la comunidad internacional, del secretario general de Naciones Unidas, de la alta comisionada y especialmente del pueblo venezolano, y han incrementado las agresiones económicas, generando una crisis humanitaria de manera alevosa y premeditada. Aún en estas circunstancias hostiles, hemos hecho grandes esfuerzos para garantizar el estado social de bienestar bolivariano, que hoy se ha visto profundamente vulnerado por las sanciones coercitivas, ilegales y unilaterales. No detendremos, sin embargo, la marcha de los programas dirigidos a garantizar la seguridad social del pueblo venezolano. Con este fin, hemos fortalecido nuestra cooperación con el sistema de Naciones Unidas de manera integrada con todos sus organismos especializados, programas y fondos. Señora Presidenta, el gobierno venezolano renovó en septiembre del 2020 por un año más el memorándum de entendimiento con la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada de Derechos Humanos para continuar fortaleciendo los vínculos de cooperación y asistencia técnica en materia de promoción y protección de los derechos humanos en Venezuela. Reitero que el Estado venezolano trabajará decididamente con los actores de este Consejo de Derechos Humanos, así como también ratifico que no aceptaremos la injerencia o intervención de ningún mecanismo inquisidor contra nuestra patria Venezuela, que pretenda usar la justa causa de los derechos humanos como herramienta política para un cambio de gobierno, un cambio de régimen por la fuerza en nuestro país. Están equivocados quienes creen que Venezuela disminuirá la cooperación alcanzada con la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada de Derechos Humanos como consecuencia de estas provocaciones ideologizadas de un grupo de gobiernos. Señora Presidenta, me permito informar a los Estados miembros que hace pocos días culminó la visita de la doctora Alena Douham, relatora especial del Sistema de Naciones Unidas sobre el tema de las repercusiones negativas de las medidas coercitivas unilaterales aplicadas sistemáticamente contra el pueblo venezolano. La doctora Alena Douham realizó una amplia agenda de reuniones que le permitió dialogar con diversos actores políticos, empresariales y sociales sobre la realidad de Venezuela. Las conclusiones de su informe preliminar son contundentes al demostrar que las sanciones y medidas coercitivas unilaterales aplicadas por Estados Unidos y la Unión Europea como herramienta deliberada para alcanzar un cambio de régimen en Venezuela violan flagrantemente el derecho internacional y todos los instrumentos universales y regionales de derechos humanos. El informe reconoce concretamente que estas acciones extraterritoriales atentan contra la vida del pueblo venezolano y contra el disfrute pleno de los derechos económicos y sociales conquistados democráticamente en las últimas 2 décadas. La relatora exigió el levantamiento de las sanciones contra Venezuela, la devolución de sus activos y las garantías de acceso al Estado venezolano a los recursos que han sido ilegalmente congelados en el mundo, así como el acceso al sistema financiero mundial. Este es el clamor de casi 30 millones de venezolanos y venezolanas víctimas de estas medidas coercitivas, unilaterales, ilegales, de esta agresión económica multidimensional. Señora Presidenta, a pesar de la campaña contra la democracia venezolana y los boicots orquestados desde Washington y Bogotá, el pasado 6 de diciembre el pueblo venezolano eligió su nueva Asamblea Nacional, su nuevo poder legislativo, de entre casi 14,000 candidatos y candidatas, pertenecientes a 107 organizaciones políticas representativas de todas las tendencias ideológicas y políticas del país. La jornada transcurrió en paz y el nuevo cuerpo parlamentario ya se encuentra legislando para blindar aún más las garantías políticas del pueblo de Venezuela. Reiteramos en ese sentido nuestro llamado al respeto a la autodeterminación de los pueblos y sumamos esfuerzos para el fortalecimiento del multilateralismo, de la concepción de un mundo multipolar, sin hegemonismos, al tiempo que reafirmamos nuestro compromiso con el cumplimiento de los Objetivos del Desarrollo Sostenible 2030. Ninguna agresión desviará a nuestro país de este noble propósito. El libertador Simón Bolívar, libertador de América, afirmó hace 200 años que el sistema de gobierno más perfecto es aquel que brinda a sus ciudadanos la mayor suma de felicidad posible, la mayor suma de seguridad social y la mayor suma de estabilidad política. Así lo creemos y instamos para que todos los actores del Consejo de Derechos Humanos y del Sistema de Naciones Unidas hagamos nuestros estos principios en todo el sistema de Naciones Unidas. Garanticemos en conjunto la felicidad, la seguridad y la estabilidad de la humanidad. Cambiemos el sistema de organización económica capitalista depredador que tanto dolor, muerte, guerras y miserias ha generado. Pensando en el futuro de la especie, nada es imposible. Seamos capaces de crear un sistema de justicia y equidad sobre los pilares del respeto de los derechos humanos, de los derechos sociales y del derecho internacional. Muchas gracias, señores y señoras, miembros del Consejo de Derechos Humanos, señora Presidenta. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Sanna Marin, Prime Minister of Finland. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to address the United Nations Human Rights Council today. Finland wishes to join this council as a full member during the 22-24 term. I am proud of our candidacy. For Finland, a strong, rules-based multilateral system is of fundamental importance. The Human Rights Council is a cornerstone of this system that plays a key role in upholding our dignity and human rights. The COVID-19 pandemic affects us all. The need for solidarity and resilience has once again become very concrete. Based on our experience, inclusive societies are better able to adapt to change and overcome crisis. Finland's own history is telling. Our development from a poor agrarian country into a stable, equal, and prosperous nation has not always been easy. Gender equality and quality education for all have made our success possible. We have built our society by including everyone and by placing human rights, fundamental freedoms, and equality at the very center. Today, I want to focus on the rights of women and girls, climate change and digital space, and human rights. We have seen a pushback on women's and girls' rights in many countries. Discrimination and violence have increased. We all must do more to fight against the trafficking of women and girls and offer better support to victims in each of our countries and globally. Sexual and gender-based violence is still used as a weapon in conflicts, repression, and ethnic cleansing. We are deeply concerned about what we are hearing from the Uyghurs, the Rohingyas, and from Tigray. The COVID-19 pandemic is worsening the situation of countless health and social workers who are mostly women. Intimate partner violence has become the so-called shadow pandemic. In Finland too, we have seen an increase in domestic violence. Globally, sexual and reproductive health and rights are more and more at risk. At the same time, women are a powerful force for change and recovery. This council is key in ensuring progress on women's and girls' rights and in building back better. Second, I want to underline the severe impacts of climate change and the enjoyment of human rights. We have a duty to prevent the negative effects of climate change. We must work to achieve a just and fair transition. In doing so, we must pay special attention to the rights of persons in the most vulnerable situations, including persons with disabilities and indigenous peoples. In order to combat climate change, we need everyone on board. Globally, empowering women and girls can be decisive in making a real change at every level. Third, I want to focus on digital space and human rights. Digitalization must become a force for the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, as it is changing the way the world works. With this in mind, it is essential that we bridge the digital divide. Finland wants to promote a safe digital space for all and to enable everyone to use their voices without the threat of violence, harassment, or hate speech. Freedoms of expression, assembly, and media are essential for democratic government. Further, the accountability of decision makers lies at the very heart of democracy, as does the rule of law. I'm deeply concerned about the recent attempts in many countries to limit citizens' rights to peacefully express their views, both online and offline. I'm particularly worried about attacks against human rights defenders, LGBTI persons, and members of civil society. We cannot allow authoritarian governments to use internet and media shutdowns as a political tool. We are extremely concerned about shrinking space for civil society in many authoritarian countries, including on our own continent. Finland also strongly condemns the mistreatment of representatives of the political opposition and other peaceful protesters we have witnessed recently. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, no country has a perfect human rights record. We all have work to do. Finland attaches great importance to the universal periodic review process and the other mechanisms of the Council. We need a Council with a broad mandate for prevention to addressing human rights violations. We support the High Commissioner for Human Rights and her office and wish to continue our excellent collaboration with increasing voluntary contributions. Our foreign policy is human rights-based. Finland works for human rights, gender equality, peace and security, and the fight against poverty globally. If elected, we would bring our contribution to the Council to ensure the fullest respect for universal human rights in our diverse world. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Josiah Frangi Mbainimarama, Prime Minister and Minister for e-Toke Affairs, Sugar Industry and Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Fiji. Excellency, the floor is yours.
The President of the Human Rights Council, the President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Heads of State, Heads of Government, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Bula Vinaka and warm greetings from Suva. Your Excellencies, I'm honored to address this high-level segment of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. When I addressed this body at its 40th session, Fiji had recently been elected into the Council. We were proud to take our place on the Council as part of a conscious and deliberate effort to play a more active role in solving the problems of the world. Fiji has long contributed disproportionately to United Nations peacekeeping, and we are very proud of our contribution. But we also have a valuable perspective to offer to other global challenges as a committed democracy and a small island developing state. And we want to bring our voice and our experience fully to the table as the world confronts these challenges. I'm speaking to you today as we mark another milestone, Fiji's election as President of the Council. This responsibility is testament to the unique power of multilateralism, which recognizes that all nations have the ability to lead, to forge consensus, to pursue truth, and to bring perspective that solve problems. Madam President, your fellow Fijians congratulate you on your election to the presidency of this council. I'm confident that your tenure will be marked by unflinching efforts to strengthen human rights in these perilous times, and you have our full support. Madam President, 2020 was indeed a challenging year, with the COVID-19 pandemic forcing a new reality for the global community and for every nation. We began 2021 by surpassing 2 million COVID deaths worldwide. Many countries have suffered severely, and I offer them my deep condolences. We have not had a case beyond the border quarantine area in Fiji since May, but that success has come at great cost to our economy. We had to shut our borders and essentially bring our tourism industry, which generates nearly 40% of our GDP, to an abrupt halt. This pandemic is not just a health crisis, it is also an equally distressing social and economic crisis. And it will have long-term health, social, and economic consequences across the globe. It has already challenged us to uphold principles of human rights based on equity, fairness, and the dignity of every human being. We have not only given up our freedom of movement in order to fight the virus, but we are struggling to ensure that all people from all nations have timely and effective access to the vaccines that promise eventually to restore our normal way of life. No nation wins in a world of immunity inequality, and so Fiji is working tirelessly to advocate the principle that vaccines will be available to the poorest of the poor, as well as people in the wealthiest nations, and make that principle a reality. We also know that developing nations will need vast inflows of capital, including grants, concessional loans, and debt forgiveness to recover from the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. It is the next great global challenge awaiting us, and we must be ready. Before the pandemic struck, we had been making great gains in improving conditions for people in the developing world and lifting millions out of poverty. We cannot accept a situation in which tens of millions of people finally gain protection from the COVID virus, only to be thrust back into abject poverty. The road to recovery must be walked together with no one left behind. The world has made significant progress in human rights over the years, and yet we see human rights threatened daily by intolerance, fear, and greed. Democracy is the great hope of humankind, and that hope rests first on free, fair, and credible elections, but also on respect for and adherence to civil, political, and socio-economic rights, on access to substantive justice, on gender equality, on strong and independent institutions, and on economic freedom. With these building blocks in place, nations grow and prosper, and their people thrive. Fiji's experience shows that this is true. I'm proud to say that the Fijian Constitution enshrines an array of civil, political, and socio-economic rights, including the right to a clean and healthy environment. And Fiji has ratified the 9 core human rights conventions as part of our commitment in our Universal Periodic Review. More importantly, we practice this universal principle of democracy and good governance. And within 2 years' time, we will hold our third genuinely democratic election in 8 years. Madam President, the rights and freedoms enshrined under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are as relevant and necessary today as they were in 1948. No matter what challenges a nation or the world faces, we must continue to defend those rights and to insist that they be respected. Governments have undertaken exceptional measures to contain the spread of the coronavirus and protect the security of citizens. It is vital to ensure that these exceptional measures, necessary as they may be, do not erode the fundamental freedoms enshrined under these conventions. Exceptional measures must be applied judiciously and which promote the values that underlie a democratic society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom. In the Pacific, the climate crisis continues. Extreme biodiversity loss, frequent and intense weather events, and sea level rise have serious consequences that cut across every aspect of our socio-economic development. Indeed, our very sovereignty is threatened. There is no choosing between battling the pandemic and battling the climate crisis. Fiji and our neighbors in the Pacific region are battling both simultaneously. The climate crisis is a global crisis because of its far-reaching implications. It is not a crisis of the future. It is a crisis now, in our time. But we can prevent it from becoming a crisis of the future if we do what we all know we must do today. Since 2016, 13 cyclones have struck our islands. One of those storms set the record as our hemisphere's strongest ever. And another, Cyclone Yasa, devastated the north of our country just this past December, which was followed by the more recent Cyclone Ana, which had caused widespread flooding in all divisions of Fiji. This has become our new normal. Through it all, Fiji continues to press on towards carbon neutrality by achieving net zero carbon emissions. Fiji recently announced new and stronger nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and have pledged to achieve society-wide net zero emissions by 2050. This commitment will soon be legislated through a groundbreaking climate change bill. Our National Adaptation Plan maps out a multi-billion-dollar effort to strengthen our climate resilience. Our commitment to plant 30 million trees and sustainably manage all 1.3 square kilometers of our ocean by 2030 could very well mean Fiji becomes a carbon-negative society in the not-too-distant future. Of course, human health is linked to the health of our environment, including our oceans. This linkage is both obvious and significant because human beings need a clean, pollution-free environment to thrive. A sustainable ecosystem will contribute to preventing future outbreaks of disease and will produce fewer health risks that can be attributed to human activities such as air pollution, toxic waste, and contamination of waterways. Threats to the ecosystems, including pollution and climate change, must be addressed in order to preserve human health. That is why we are planting those 30 million trees and restoring mangroves and investing in natural barriers against floods and tidal surges. Madam President, the world is now at a crossroad, and our future will be determined by our choice to strengthen the global human rights agenda. But what does this mean? It means more than talk. It means we protect and advance freedom, oppose oppressive rule, promote democracy, enshrine tolerance, and empower people. In this last decade of sustainable development, countries must work together and collectively take bold and courageous decisions for the betterment of our peoples. Likewise, we must see the fight against climate change as a fight that is interwoven with the need to advance and protect human rights. The measures we take to mitigate climate change and adapt to its effects must be taken in consultation with the people and with respect for the communities and traditions the people have established. In Fiji, we have plans to move some 43 communities in whole or in part away from encroaching seas, and we have already moved 6. It is not just a matter of building a new community. People have lived in these communities for generations. Their grandparents and great-grandparents are buried there. Their lives and culture are deeply tied to that place, and yet they must move. Each move is planned in close cooperation with the residents themselves, so that we can find the best solutions together. Likewise, we work closely with every community to encourage sustainable practices, to adapt structures, infrastructure, schools, and agriculture to the new reality. It is not for government to dictate. It is for government to listen, to inform, to encourage, and to pave the way. Unfortunately, Madam President, some leaders sometimes find human rights to be an unwelcome obstacle to the actions they fervently believe they need to take. But that is folly. And the leaders who trust the people always learn that ultimately people are rational and wise, and the people will help them find solutions that are practical, effective, and just. Vinakavakalevu, and thank you.
Vinakavakalevu, thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Aurelio Chiokoi, Acting Prime Minister and Acting Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Moldova. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Madam President, first of all, allow me to congratulate you on your election as President of the Human Rights Council. I wish you much success in these challenging times. Excellencies, dear friends, only 1 year has passed since we addressed this body in the magnificent alliance of civilizations room, without realizing how different the year 2020 will turn out for all of us. The pandemic, which in February last year was only starting to unfold, showed us how vulnerable, unprepared, and skeptical we all were to the risk of having a virus bring the world to a standstill and change our lives beyond recognition. It showed how fragile our health system was and that massive investments were needed if we wanted to be able to effectively ensure the right to health for all. Access to the right to education has also been severely impacted, affecting students, pupils from low-income families, rural areas, and minorities the hardest. It demonstrated how important it is to bridge the digital gap in the education sector in order to efficiently apply alternative methods of learning. Furthermore, the pandemic has shown, even in the countries with a good gender equality track record, that women are among the groups most heavily impacted by the societal effects of the crisis. Against this background, another disturbing phenomenon continues to unfold. Gender-based domestic violence has been increasing exponentially as many women have been forced to lock down at home with their abusers. We fully agree that we cannot have an effective post-COVID-19 recovery without placing human rights at the head of response measures. 1 year into the pandemic, it is clear that the virus has tested our openness and cooperation and the very concept of solidarity. Nevertheless, I am certain that the pandemic, by its nature, will bring nations even closer together, foster more cooperation, more solidarity, and more equity. Now that the scientific community has delivered the extraordinary feat of developing several vaccines so fast in a so rapid manner, we need more cooperation and more concerted actions in order to ensure access to safe and effective vaccines for all. I would like to take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude to every country that has answered our calls for assistance in fighting the pandemic at the national level. Excellencies, in the same spirit of fostering cooperation and sharing experiences, allow me to highlight a number of positive steps that we have taken during the past year in order to advance the human rights agenda through democratic reforms in the Republic of Moldova. With reference to our international commitments, including on human rights, one major development has been organization of the first meeting of the National Human Rights Council. Dear friends, I would also like to mention our continued fruitful cooperation with the human rights mechanisms. In this respect, I will mention another significant development was the presentation in June 2020 of the first voluntary national review on the implementation of the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. The state institutions have already started the complex task of preparing the next Universal Periodic Review report of the Republic of Moldova for the third cycle. We express our appreciation to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for providing valuable assistance in this process. At the national level, in order to streamline a human rights approach to democratic governance, we have embarked on an ambitious plan to develop and implement the justice sector reform. In the same context, the government drafted and sent to the parliament a draft law amending the constitution with regard to the composition of the Superior Council of Magistracy. These much-needed changes, once approved, will strengthen independence, impartiality, accountability, efficiency, and transparency of the court system in my country, which is deeply needed. We have also managed to ensure one of the most sacred elements of a democratic society, the exercise of right to vote, including for our citizens living abroad. The Republic of Moldova held presidential elections in November last year in the midst of a pandemic, and the people chose for the first time a woman as the president of my country. A large package of socio-economic support measures was approved, benefiting both business and individuals during the state of emergency. The wide number of labor migrants who returned to Moldova after losing their jobs abroad have been entitled to social allowance. On the right to education, while we're still working towards bridging the digital gap in the education sector, lessons have been filmed and broadcasted on television for households without the internet access. Madam President, at the same time, I would like to draw the attention of the Council to another issue of utmost importance for my country, the protracted conflict in the Transnistrian region of the Republic of Moldova and the grave human rights situation in that very region. The situation, which has long been marked by these systematic violations, has deteriorated even more since the pandemic erupted and those who hold de facto control have imposed a so-called state of emergency. Under the cover of measures to control the spread of COVID-19, fundamental human rights have been severely restricted, practically isolating in a prison-like system the people living in that region. Tiraspol has banned the free movement of 95 doctors, dozens of prosecutors and judges, 22 custom officers, hundreds of employees, and even students living on the left bank of the Dniester River and working or studying in the other side of the river. Only after the government's unrelenting demands and with the support of the international partners, Transnistrian leaders accepted to allow the above-mentioned medical staff to cross the administrative line without any hindrance, starting with February 4 this year. I call on the international community to speak out against the human rights violations occurring in the region. This is among the very few instruments to ensure some form of accountability for those violations and give hope for the people living in that very region. To conclude, I would like to reiterate my country's firm determination to step up efforts in promoting and protecting human rights for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I now have the honor of inviting His Excellency, Mr. David Zalkarliani, Vice Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Georgia. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Madam President, at the outset, I would like to congratulate you with the election to the position of the President of the Human Rights Council and wish you and the members of the Bureau every success in your endeavors. Excellencies, since the last high-level meeting, we have been fighting common invisible enemy, the COVID-19, that continues to challenge the progress on the way to achieving sustainable development and enjoyment of human rights. Unfortunately, despite the Secretary General's appeal for an immediate global ceasefire, the human rights situation in different parts of the world continue to deteriorate on a daily basis. We continue witnessing brazen violations of the human rights in Georgia's regions occupied by the Russian Federation, as well as in Ukraine, where the Russian Federation has illegally occupied and annexed territories of the sovereign countries in blatant violation of the fundamental norms and principles of international law. Excellencies, each year, the Human Rights Council adopts important thematic and country-specific resolutions, including annual resolution on cooperation with Georgia, focusing on the situation in Abkhazia and Skhin Valley regions of Georgia. Regrettably, despite direct calls of the resolution and the repeated efforts of the High Commissioner, the office has not been able to enter Russian-occupied Georgian regions. This takes place against the backdrop of continuously deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation on the ground, with fundamental rights of ethnic Georgians being violated on a daily basis, including during the pandemic. Continuous installation of razor wire fences and other artificial obstacles along the occupation line in adjacent areas, as well as unprecedentedly lengthy closure of the so-called crossing points and restriction of freedom of movement, including denial of medical evacuations that often leads to the fatal cases, have extremely aggravated the humanitarian situation. Such destructive actions of the occupying power continue to prevent the efforts of the government of Georgia to assist its citizens living on the other side of the occupation line during the COVID-19. Moreover, amid the pandemic, my country has been hit by Russia's intensified hybrid warfare on a daily basis through disinformation and large-scale cyber attacks, including propaganda against the Richard Lugar Laboratory Center for Public Health Research, which has been important in Georgia's fight against the pandemic. Dear colleagues, the case of Georgian citizen Zaza Gacheladze, who was shot, wounded, and illegally detained by the Russian occupation forces in last July, is a clear example how the occupation forces manipulate people's lives. The recent provocative decision of the occupation regime to prolong his illegal detention for more than 12 years is outrageous. Madam High Commissioner, Madam President, this is a matter that requires your immediate involvement. Distinguished colleagues, despite repeated calls, literally nothing has been done with respect to execution of justice in brutal cases of deprivation of lives of Georgian citizens in the Russia-occupied regions, which has fueled the sense of impunity and led to further cases of torture and deprivation of lives. Perpetrators must be held accountable. In this regard, I would like to reiterate the importance of the Otchozoria Tatunashvili list, which envisages imposing restrictive measures on the individuals responsible for human rights abuses in the occupied regions as a preventive mechanism, and I count on your support in this matter. Distinguished colleagues, unfortunately, IDPs and refugees expelled by the Russian Federation as a result of multiple waves of ethnic cleansing from Georgia's occupied regions are still unable to return to their homes. Russia's destructive actions threaten the remaining population with another wave of forceful displacement. We fully concur with the Secretary General's repeated call that the absence of political solution cannot and should not be obstacle to the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms of those lacking the minimal safeguards and living under the imminent threat of expulsion. Therefore, resolute stance of the international community, including this august body, is essential. With this in mind, we table a draft resolution on cooperation with Georgia during the current session and counting on your support. Excellencies, the recent judgment by the European Court of Human Rights in the case of Georgia versus Russia, unequivocally confirmed Russia's occupation and effective control over the Georgian indivisible regions and Russia's responsibility for human rights violation on the ground during the August 2008 Russia-Georgia war, as well as subsequent period of occupation. Having said that, we call on Russia once again to cease violations of human rights in these occupied territories of Georgia, respect Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and fulfill its international obligations under the EU-mediated 12 August 2000 ceasefire agreement. Madam President, during pandemic, the role of international organizations has gained even more importance. We fully share your view that the international human rights system and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development together offer us brightly lit path out of this crisis. We also subscribe to the High Commissioner's call to acknowledge that human rights are critical to the recovery from the pandemic and underline the immense role of the Human Rights Council, including its mechanism in this process. Georgia stands ready to remain actively engaged in the work of the Council by contributing to its growing inclusivity and particularly focusing on initiatives on advancement of rights of the most vulnerable groups with special emphasis on children, women, girls, and forcefully displaced persons, as well as human rights defenders and increased civil society participation. In this regard, we condemn any act of intimidation and reprisal against human rights defenders and civil society representatives. The pandemic has further accentuated the interlinkage between the human rights and environmental protection, which my country back in 2019 rightly set as one of the priorities during the presidency in the Council of Europe. We deem it important to keep this issue high on the international agenda. Georgia continues to be a strong supporter of the UPR process. We have just successfully undergone the third cycle review, and I would like to express appreciation to states for their engagement and valuable recommendations. In conclusion, as a candidate to the Human Rights Council for the term of 2023-2025, Georgia once again reiterates its readiness to join international community's efforts to build back better from the pandemic and strengthen the promotion and protection of human rights across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honor to invite His Excellency Mr. Mukhtar Tubedi, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan, to make his statement. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, please allow me to congratulate Madam Ambassador Najat Shamim Khan on her election as the Human Rights Council President. Taking this opportunity, I would like to commend the Human Rights Council work, which despite the global pandemic held all of its 3 regular sessions last year and remains the only UN human rights body that stayed on schedule. This required commitment, coordination, creative thinking and approaches, as well as the flexibility to do things in new manner. This also demanded strong leadership of the Council, which we all witnessed under the presidency of the permanent representative of Austria, Madame Elisabeth Tichy-Fissenberger. Ladies and gentlemen, today every nation in the world faces and fights the common challenge of a devastating global pandemic. Therefore, I would like to start my address by honoring lives of more than 2 million people lost due to COVID-19. The pandemic has inflamed social, ecological, and health systems and negatively affected economies, as well as diminished fundamental human rights and put the achievement of SDGs under serious threat. Landlocked developing countries have been particularly affected by the situation, damaging welfare, investment, trade, and free movement of people. In face of this, Kazakhstan has supported global response to pandemic through its bilateral and multilateral commitments. These especially hard times proved once again that we need to strengthen our resilience to future challenges by displaying unity and recommitting to multilateral cooperation and solidarity. This year is an essential milestone for Kazakhstan, the 30th anniversary of its independence. It's an excellent occasion to reaffirm our commitment to respecting and protecting fundamental human rights. We recognize the importance of strengthening internal mechanisms aimed at improving people's lives, creating more social and economic opportunities. Despite the nationwide lockdown and disruption it caused, we continue to implement President Tokayev's package of political and economic reforms aimed at building an economically strong, democratically advanced, and human-oriented listening state. Let me refer to the particular results of these reforms launched in 2019 regarding the protection of freedoms and human rights. Halving of registration barrier for creating political parties, introduction of a 30% quota for women and youth on electoral party lists, formalization and strengthening of the parliamentary opposition, decriminalization of defamation and initiation of humanization of social discord incitement. Adopting a new law on assemblies made it easier to organize and participate in peaceful assemblies. Kazakhstan considers abolishing the death penalty as one of the primary objectives of its human rights policy. A year ago, at the 43rd session of the Council, I announced that the government would join the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on the abolition of the death penalty. I'm pleased to inform you that we have signed the second protocol last September and ratified this document early this year. Together with international partners, we have supported various initiatives to raise awareness that death penalty does not prevent an increase in violent crimes and encourage abolishing the death penalty in Kazakhstan and the wider region. Therefore, we look forward to working with the International Commission Against the Death Penalty and the support group to promote the idea of declaring Central Asia and Mongolia the first ever zone free of death penalty. We have put in pipeline accession to the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on communications procedure, ratification of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, designing a concept for the development of a local self-government and law on public control, creation of single institution for online petition, as well as improvement of legislation to combat torture, human trafficking, and protect citizens, especially children, from cyberbullying. Furthermore, this January, President Tokayev has put forward a new collection of political reforms focusing on strengthening the human rights protection system, expanding civic participation in political life, developing parliamentarism, and further democratizing the country. This package includes reducing the threshold for political parties to gain seats in the Majlis, lower house of parliament, from 7 to 5%, introduction the option against all in ballots for all future elections, legal formalization of institution of online petitions, adoption of a law on the Commissioner for Human Rights, the Ombudsman to streamline and reinforce activities of this institution in various areas, implementation of the Youth Development Index to evaluate the efficiency of youth policy of the government, introduction of measures to support charities and related activities. Madam President, distinguished speakers, and members of the Council, in the aftermath of the pandemic, it's clear that attainability of our shared goals outlined in the SDGs are under threat, and it demands prompt and well-coordinated steps to get us back on track. SDGs agenda premise is to leave no one behind. In this context, I would like to emphasize, like many dignitaries before me today, that the rights of women, children, elders, and persons with disabilities were disproportionately affected by the crisis. The pandemic caused a disruption to education system, which have the potential to cause a very real and very severe long-term impact on our society and human rights in particular. In the present situation, let me underline the international community's need to display unity and cooperation. In this context, I would like to note the solidarity exhibited by volunteers and activists worldwide, which not only helped to address the problems, but also brought many overlooked issues to the forefront. As a responsible member of the international community, Kazakhstan will continue to make a visible contribution to collective efforts to promote peace and ensure human rights, dignity, and prosperity. Therefore, we are looking forward to our membership in the Human Rights Council for 2022-24. If elected, Kazakhstan would strengthen dialogue, constructive engagement, consensus building, and international cooperation. As a member of the Human Rights Council, Kazakhstan commits promoting effective implementation of all civil and political, economic, social, and cultural rights. We have placed it high on the list of our top priorities, the fight against all forms of intolerance and discrimination, including gender discrimination, racism, sexism, xenophobia, protection of children's rights and rights of persons with disabilities, the universal abolition of the death penalty, the fight against torture and enforced disappearance, the freedom of religion and belief, the fight against extreme poverty, and many other subjects that will promote and foster equitable globalization and sustainable development. And lastly, Kazakhstan commits to promoting respect for human rights in the fight against COVID-19 and learning lessons from the pandemic in this respect. Concluding my speech, I would like to reiterate Kazakhstan's strong commitment to meet its international obligations and continue its close cooperation with the UN and all its mechanisms to promote and protect fundamental human rights. And thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Alfonso Nisue Makoe, Third Deputy Prime Minister in charge of human rights of Equatorial Guinea. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Presidente del Consejo de Derechos Humanos, señora alta comisionada, distinguidos delegados, miembros de la sociedad civil, señoras y señores, permítanme, en nombre de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial, intervenir en esta 46 periodo de sesiones del Consejo y sumarnos a las felicitaciones de los oradores anteriores. Aprovecho la ocasión para expresarles en nombre del Presidente de la República, Jefe de Estado y de Gobierno, Su Excelencia Obiang Bazogo, los saludos de paz y de solidaridad, deseándoles un próspero y venturoso año 2021. Distinguidos delegados, mi Gobierno expresa su predisposición de mantener siempre una estrecha cooperación con el sistema de las Naciones Unidas en materia de derechos humanos para conseguir un mundo cada vez más respetuoso y comprometido hacia un desarrollo sostenible en los principios de igualdad, justicia y paz. Reafirmamos así nuestra voluntad política y el compromiso de dedicar más esfuerzos y capacidad para alcanzar una sociedad nacional en la que los derechos humanos constituyen los valores supremos de la convivencia pacífica y democrática. Señor presidente del Consejo, señora alta comisionada, a pesar de los esfuerzos desplegados conforme a la implementación de las recomendaciones aceptadas en el último informe nacional en el marco del examen periódico universal, la pandemia del COVID-19 ha provocado en el país varias repercusiones directas en el ejercicio del goce y disfrute de varios derechos humanos. En el mecanismo de lucha y control para evitar la dispersión de la pandemia en el país, el Gobierno ha adoptado medidas excepcionales en respuesta a dicha pandemia, creando 2 comités, uno político y otro técnico, y se ha elaborado un Plan Nacional de Vigilancia y Respuesta a la Pandemia de la COVID-19 que se ha beneficiado con una contribución significativa de los recursos del Gobierno de la Nación. Se ha puesto en funcionamiento un laboratorio de investigación en salud pública con la acreditación de la OMS para la realización de pruebas PCR. Se ha elaborado un plan nacional de vacunación contra la COVID-19 que ha permitido la reducción de la incidencia y mortalidad de la enfermedad en el país. Las negociaciones del Gobierno para la adquisición de la vacuna contra la COVID-19 y se ha puesto en funcionamiento hospitales de referencia para el manejo de casos de COVID-19 con la adquisición de varios medicamentos de mayor impacto en la lucha contra la pandemia. Se está desarrollando en todo el ámbito nacional campañas de sensibilización a la población para el cambio de comportamientos y la prevención de la transmisión local de la COVID a través de los medios de comunicación respectivamente. En el sector de la educación, el Gobierno ha puesto en funcionamiento la Universidad Afroamericana de África Central en la ciudad de La Paz, provincia de Djibouti, y que tiene una categoría internacional que impulsa la investigación y la innovación. Y se ha implementado el proyecto de construcción del campus universitarios, uno en la ciudad de Malabo y otro en la ciudad de Bata. El Gobierno está llevando a cabo los proyectos de construcción, rehabilitación y suministros de mobiliarios y equipos didácticos en todos los distritos escolares del ámbito nacional. En el sector de la justicia, los avances más significativos son la aprobación de la Ley de Anticorrupción, el Código Penal que ya está en estudio final en el Parlamento Nacional y que prevé la abolición de la pena de la muerte y la revisión y modificación de la anterior Ley de Nacionalidad. En el sector de asuntos sociales e igualdad de género, cabe destacar el anteproyecto de ley orgánica sobre la protección integral para prevenir, erradicar y sancionar la violencia contra la mujer y la promoción de la ley contra la violencia de género. Se tiene en estudio el anteproyecto de ley sobre la homosexualidad. Una comisión de derechos humanos integrada con los miembros de la Cruz Roja ha realizado varias visitas de inspección en las cárceles públicas del ámbito nacional para conocer el estado de cada preso, verificar si hay aglomeración o superpoblación carcelaria o situaciones de detenciones arbitrarias. Sobre trata de personas, el Gobierno ha elaborado un plan de acción nacional para su lucha y está trabajando conjuntamente con la Embajada de los Estados Unidos en nuestro país, centrando la atención en la formación, sensibilización y orientación a los funcionarios de migración, comisarios de las fronteras y al Comité Intersectorial de Lucha contra la Trata de Personas. Varios seminarios de sensibilización están siendo desarrollados para concienciar a los agentes del orden público sobre la importancia del respeto a los derechos humanos, así como indicarles las herramientas y mecanismos para erradicar la tortura en todos sus términos en base a la ley número 6/2006 de fecha 2 de noviembre sobre la prevención y sanción de la tortura. Mi gobierno es consciente de que los derechos humanos deben guiar la aplicación de los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible para lograr un mundo y un bienestar para todos. Reiteramos una vez más mantener nuestro compromiso de trabajar para elaborar los estándares nacionales de promoción y protección de los derechos humanos, convencidos de que el respeto al Estado de Derecho es un pilar fundamental que permite aumentar la capacidad de los estados para mejorar la calidad de vida de sus poblaciones y prevenir las posibles violaciones a los derechos humanos. Auguramos que los trabajos de esta sesión ordinaria del Consejo de Derechos Humanos de las Naciones Unidas se desarrollen dentro de un ambiente de mutua cordialidad, comprensión y que se concluyan con muchos éxitos. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Pham Binh Minh, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Vietnam. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to address these 46 sessions of the Council. Looking back, 2020 has been the most difficult year in many decades. The COVID-19 pandemic has claimed the lives of millions and affected the well-being of billions around the world. It has strained public health and social security systems of all countries. And as Secretary General Guterres put it, the pandemic has been triggering and exacerbating various human rights challenges. This should not, however, be a cause for despair. We can already see beams of hope. The world is moving toward a new normal. The global economy is seeing signs of gradual recovery. Vaccines has been developed and made available for public use in record time. Digital transformations and applications of science and technology, particularly information technology, have provided solutions to challenges in all aspects of human life. The pandemic has also offered the world a new pathway to build forward better, based on adaptability, innovation, cooperation, and solidarity at local, national, and global levels. Madam President, Vietnam believes strongly that ensuring a safe society against epidemic like COVID-19 is the best way to ensure that each and every member of the society can fully enjoy the human rights. We continue to put emphasis on the protections and promotions of all human rights and fundamental freedoms of our people. Even in this most difficult of times, Vietnam has tackled the COVID-19 pandemic based on putting the people at the center of all its efforts. Prompt and determined actions has been taken to control the outbreaks, to protect the health and safety of the people as a matter of top priority. Efforts are also made to maintain economic growth and social welfare to leave no one behind. Thanks to our whole of government approach and the overwhelming support and solidarity of our people, COVID-19 has largely been controlled in Vietnam. The economy continued to grow at almost 3% in 2020. And timely support has been given to businesses and people affected by the pandemic, especially vulnerable groups like the elderly, women, children, and people with disabilities. What we have experienced and achieved clearly indicate that efforts to ensure human rights must take into account the historical, political, and social and developmental particularities of each country. Madam President, COVID-19 has left no country untouched. No one can be safe until everyone is safe. As the international community, we are all in this together. Therefore, international solidarity and cooperation is critical to help us rise above challenges and move forward. Vietnam is grateful for the valuable support from our partner countries, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and people around the world. On its part, Vietnam has provided medical masks and supplies to support more than 50 countries and international partners in their response to the pandemic. As proposed by Vietnam, the United Nations General Assembly adopted by consensus a resolution proclaiming December 27 as the International Day of Epidemic Preparedness to help raise awareness on the importance of preventing and responding to epidemics. Desiring to further contribute effectively to joint efforts in protecting and promoting human rights, Vietnam presented its candidature for membership of the Human Rights Council for the term 2023 to 2025. We are honored to have been endorsed as the ASEAN candidate for this post and look forward to the support from all UN member states. We are confident that together we can overcome the challenges posed by the current pandemic and build a better future for all. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Madame Sophie Wilmé, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Affairs and Foreign Trade, and the Federal Cultural Institutions of the Kingdom of Belgium. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, Madame la Haut-Commissaire, Excellences, chers collègues, Mesdames et Messieurs, c'est un plaisir et un privilège pour moi de pouvoir m'adresser à ces hautes assemblées. Tout en m'alignant pleinement sur la déclaration de l'Union européenne, je souhaite vous faire part des priorités du gouvernement belge et de quelques réflexions sur les défis auxquels nous faisons face aujourd'hui en matière de droits humains. La pandémie qui a touché toute l'humanité est une douloureuse leçon d'humilité. Cette crise qui accentue les inégalités nous a rappelé l'importance des droits humains et leur universalité. Comme l'a dit le secrétaire général des Nations Unies fin janvier devant l'Assemblée générale, il faut faire de 2021 une année des possibles. Je suis convaincue que la meilleure approche pour une sortie de crise est de garantir l'universalité des droits humains. Plus que jamais, il nous faut réaffirmer que les droits humains ne sont pas une faveur que les États accordent. Ils sont une obligation à l'égard de tous, toujours, à l'égard des plus vulnérables, à l'égard de ceux qui nous paraissent différents, à l'égard des plus critiques aussi. Madame la Présidente, ce principe d'universalité s'applique de toute évidence aux femmes et aux filles. Je rejoins l'avis du secrétaire général. L'égalité des genres est peut-être le plus grand défi du monde en matière de droits humains. Il y a plus de 25 ans, nous nous sommes engagés à prendre des mesures audacieuses pour réaliser ce but. Bien que nous ayons réalisé des progrès, soyons clairs, aucun pays n'a vraiment réussi. La crise de la Covid-19 pèse sur le droit des femmes et des filles dans tous les domaines. Et les femmes sont souvent sous-représentées dans la prise de décision sur la réponse de la crise. En cette année de 20e anniversaire de la Conférence mondiale contre le racisme, trop de personnes sont encore victimes de discrimination sur base de leur race, de leur origine ethnique, de leur couleur ou de leur religion. Nous devons unir nos efforts pour vaincre le fléau du racisme qui remet en question l'égalité fondamentale de tous les êtres humains. La Belgique met tout en œuvre pour élaborer son plan d'action national contre le racisme. Nous nous réjouissons de l'organisation d'une réunion débat dédiée à cette thématique lors de cette session. Compte tenu de son engagement sans relâche pour l'abolition universelle de la peine capitale, la Belgique participera également à la réunion de haut niveau sur la question de la peine de mort. Le droit à la vie est le droit le plus fondamental, une condition sans laquelle la jouissance d'autres droits serait privée de tout sens. C'est pourquoi la Belgique, ensemble avec d'autres États, présentera une nouvelle résolution sur la question de la peine de mort à cette haute assemblée en septembre. Madame la Présidente, mon pays soutient fortement ce Conseil et ses instruments. Le système des procédures spéciales est d'une importance primordiale. Il s'agit en quelque sorte des yeux et des oreilles de la communauté internationale. Par ces alertes précoces, elles assistent le Conseil dans son mandat de prévention. À cet égard, il est primordial de faciliter la possibilité pour eux d'effectuer des visites sur place. Mon pays a d'ailleurs adressé une invitation permanente aux procédures spéciales et j'encourage ceux qui ne l'ont pas encore fait à en faire de même. La société civile, à son tour, est également un acteur clé dans la promotion et la protection des droits humains. En de nombreux endroits dans le monde, son rôle est aujourd'hui sous pression. On voit l'espace d'expression de voix critiques se réduire et le nombre d'agressions directes ciblées contre les défenseurs des droits humains augmenter. Il est primordial d'assurer la défense des défenseurs. La Belgique, avec ses partenaires de l'Union européenne, s'engage plus que jamais pour les soutenir. Madame la Présidente, la Belgique s'engage à veiller à la cohérence entre son action internationale et le respect des droits humains à l'intérieur de ses frontières. C'est pourquoi je présenterai début mai le bilan de la Belgique en matière de droits humains dans le cadre de l'examen périodique universel. Cet exercice interactif est très utile pour passer en revue la situation des droits humains dans tous les États membres de l'ONU, sans distinction. Cet engagement pour une mise en œuvre en interne de nos valeurs est à mon sens aussi la meilleure base pour le dialogue international sur les droits humains que nous voulons mener. Au sein de ce Conseil, ce dialogue se déclinera de différentes manières. Un échange de bonnes pratiques, de la coopération technique sur des sujets spécifiques, mais aussi, quand la situation le requiert, la condamnation de violations ou abus graves ou systématiques des droits humains. Pour conclure, je voudrais à nouveau confirmer l'engagement de la Belgique en faveur de ce Conseil. J'espère que la candidature de mon pays pour devenir membre du Conseil pendant la période 23-25 recevra un accueil bienveillant des gouvernements ici représentés. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mr. Mustafa Al-Ramid, Minister of State for Human Rights and Relations with Parliament of Morocco. Excellency, the floor is yours.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدة رئيسة مجلس حقوق الإنسان، السيدة المفوضة السامية لحقوق الإنسان، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، حضرات السيدات والسادة، يطيب لي باسم المملكة المغربية أن أعبر لكم عن سعادتي بالمشاركة في الدورة 46 لمجلسكم الموقر، وهي مناسبة لأقدم تهنئتي للسيدة نزهة شميم خان وبلدها فيجي على تولي رئاسة مجلس حقوق الإنسان. كما أود توجيه عبارات التقدير للسيدة المفوضة السامية على الجهود المبذولة في ظل الظرفية الاستثنائية التي تعيشها البشرية لدعم ومساعدة الدول على الوفاء بالتزاماتها في سياق تدبير الانعكاسات السلبية للجائحة على التمتع الكامل بحقوق الإنسان. ولا يفوتني كذلك أن أعرب عن امتناني العميق لجهود ومبادرات السيد الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، ولا سيما من خلال الخطة العالمية لمواجهة هذه الجائحة. السيدة الرئيسة، لقد اعتمدت بلادنا طبقا للتعليمات السامية لجلالة الملك محمد السادس، وانطلاقا من إمكاناتها الذاتية، مقاربة وطنية خالصة للتصدي لجائحة كورونا وتدبير آثارها. تميزت بالاستباقية والتكامل والشمولية والحرص على الموازنة بين التدابير الاحترازية المتخذة وتحديات الوضع الاقتصادي والاجتماعي والالتزامات الدولية في مجال حقوق الإنسان. وقد عملت المملكة المغربية على تعبئة كل إمكانياتها وطاقاتها من أجل تعزيز حماية الحق في الحياة والحق في الصحة كأولوية قصوى، كما سخرت كافة الموارد المتاحة لدعم الفئات الاجتماعية الهشة والمتضررة والتخفيف من حدة الأزمة على المقاولات الوطنية وتطوير خطة للإنعاش الاقتصادي. وفي نفس الإطار تسهر بلادنا بداية من أواخر الشهر الماضي على تأمين القيام بحملة وطنية للتلقيح المجاني ضد فيروس كوفيد-19 لفائدة جميع المغاربة والأجانب المقيمين بالمملكة المغربية، ومن أجل الترسيخ الفعلي للحقوق الاجتماعية وتكريس مبدأ المساواة وعدم التمييز بين كل الفئات في التمتع بهذه الحقوق الأساسية، تنكب بلادنا على تطوير برنامج لتوفير الحماية الاجتماعية الشاملة بشكل تدريجي. السيدة الرئيسة، لقد حرصت بلادنا في ظل ظروف الجائحة على مواصلة تفاعلها مع الآليات الأممية لحقوق الإنسان، حيث تقاسمت تجربتها في تدبير هذه الأزمة ومواجهة تداعياتها من خلال تقرير قدمناه جوابا على الاستبيان المشترك للإجراءات الخاصة حول أثر جائحة فيروس كورونا على التمتع بحقوق الإنسان، وتقرير مقدم للجنة الفرعية لمنع التعذيب بشأن تفعيل مضامين وثيقتها الاستشارية، وإيمانا منها بأعراف التضامن الدولي في مثل هذه الظروف الاستثنائية، وعملا بقرار مجلس الأمن 2532 في يوليوز 2020، وانسجاما مع رؤيتها لإفريقيا، لم تدخر بلادنا بمبادرة من جلالة الملك محمد السادس جهدا في تقديم الدعم والمساعدة ل 15 دولة إفريقية صديقة من أجل مواجهة الجائحة. السيدة الرئيسة، واصلت المملكة المغربية تنفيذا لالتزاماتها بالتعاون مع هيئات المعاهدات، حيث يجري حاليا التفاعل مع اللجنة المعنية بالقضاء على جميع أشكال التمييز للمرأة، كما باشرت بلادنا تعزيزا لانخراطها الجدي في دينامية إصلاح نظام هيئات المعاهدات، اعتماد المسطرة المبسطة لتقديم عدد من تقاريرها السنوية، وبنفس الروح تواصل انفتاحها على الإجراءات الخاصة لمجلس حقوق الإنسان من خلال توجيه دعوة رسمية للمقرر الخاص المعني بالحق في الحصول على مياه الشرب للقيام بزيارة رسمية إلى المغرب خلال السنة الجارية للوقوف على الجهود والتحديات في هذا المجال. وتعزيزا لهذه الدينامية، قررت المملكة المغربية الترشح لعضوية مجلس حقوق الإنسان للفترة ما بين 2023 2025، ويحظى هذا الترشيح بدعم الاتحاد الإفريقي وجامعة الدول العربية وعدد من التجمعات الجهوية والدول الصديقة. سيدة الرئيسة، إن المملكة المغربية تؤكد تشبثها والتزامها بالمسار الأممي الرامي إلى التوافق على حل سياسي وواقعي وعملي يحترم سيادتها ووحدة ترابها، وتبقى مبادرة الحكم الذاتي باعتبارها مقترحا جديا وذو مصداقية الأساس الوحيد الذي ينبغي اعتماده لتسوية نهائية لهذا النزاع الإقليمي المفتعل، وعلى الأطراف الأخرى تحمل مسؤوليتها والانخراط بكل جدية وحسن نية في المسلسل السياسي للموائد المستديرة، كما تنص على ذلك قرارات مجلس الأمن الدولي ذات الصلة. وإذا كان للمشاريع التنموية المنجزة بالأقاليم الجنوبية للمملكة مؤشرات جد إيجابية على أوضاع الساكنة، فإن بعض مواطنينا الذين ما زالوا محتجزين بمخيمات تندوف يعيشون أوضاعا مأساوية تتنافى مع حقوق الإنسان وحرياته الأساسية، مما يستدعي تدخلا عاجلا لتحريرهم، ولا سيما الأطفال الذين يتم استغلالهم وتجنيدهم على شكل ميليشيات في انتهاك صارخ للمواثيق والمعايير الدولية ذات الصلة. واغتنم هذه المناسبة للتذكير بالتدخل السلمي والمشروع للمملكة المغربية أواخر السنة الماضية لإعادة السير العادي لحركة التنقل المدنية والتجارية بمعبر القرقرة في المنطقة العازلة بعد عرقلتها وتجميدها باستغلال مدنيين من طرف عناصر مسلحة تابعة للبوليزاريو في تحدي سافر للنداءات المتكررة للأمين العام لمنظمة الأمم المتحدة وقرارات مجلس الأمن. سيد الرئيس، لقد شكلت جائحة كورونا منعطفا محوريا في تاريخ البشرية لما خلفته من آثار عميقة على إمكانات الدول في ضمان التمتع بحقوق الإنسان، وهو ما يفرض على المجتمع الدولي بكل مكوناته تعزيز قواعد الوفاء بالالتزامات والتشبث بقيم التضامن والتعاون متعدد الأطراف قصد إعادة بناء مستقبلنا المشترك على متلازمة حقوق الإنسان والديمقراطية والتنمية المستدامة. ختاما، أتمنى لأشغال هذه الدورة كل التوفيق والنجاح، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this was the last speaker on the list for this meeting. We will now have a short technical break and will reconvene in a few minutes to continue with the high-level segment. I hereby close the first meeting of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the second meeting of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. We will continue with the high-level segment. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Felipe Carlos Sola, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Trade and Worship of Argentina. Excellency, you have the floor.
Señor presidente, la Argentina viene a reafirmar su compromiso con la construcción de sociedades más igualitarias, más justas, más solidarias, más diversas y más inclusivas. Frente al falso dilema entre salvar vidas o salvar la economía que nos impuso la pandemia del COVID-19, nuestro país eligió guiarse por un enfoque de derechos humanos como fundamento de las políticas públicas desplegadas frente a la crisis. Todos tenemos derecho a la salud y a un trabajo digno. Todos tenemos derecho a acceder a los medicamentos, a las vacunas y a las tecnologías médicas esenciales para prevenir y tratar el contagio del COVID-19. Pero no todos los países tenemos la misma capacidad de respuesta. Para salvaguardar esos derechos, la Argentina debió realizar un esfuerzo sin precedentes en términos de inversión sanitaria, de inversión social y de inversión productiva. Todo eso en medio de un complejo proceso de reestructuración de nuestra deuda externa a fin de hacerla sostenible en el tiempo. Hemos conducido esa negociación con apego a las resoluciones de este Consejo de Derechos Humanos y de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas, por las que se llama a los estados y a las instituciones financieras privadas y públicas a garantizar que el cumplimiento de los compromisos derivados de la deuda externa no socaven los derechos humanos de la población, en particular sus derechos económicos, sociales y culturales. Señor presidente, la pandemia del COVID-19 puso de manifiesto varias inequidades con las que ya convivíamos, pero que hoy resultan más evidentes aún. No solo la de los que tienen en relación a los que no tienen. Hoy somos más conscientes de la grave incidencia de desigualdad y la violencia de género en todas las esferas de la vida de las personas. Para nuestro país, el logro de la igualdad sustantiva entre varones y mujeres es una prioridad y además es un pilar central de la democracia. Hemos instrumentado por eso un enfoque de género en la medida de protección social y laboral en el marco de la pandemia. Cada una de esas medidas ha sido hecha según este enfoque de género. Y hemos promovido la corresponsabilidad y una distribución más justa en las tareas de cuidado. Como país también estamos orgullosos de haber sancionado la ley de interrupción voluntaria del embarazo. Somos conscientes de que aún enfrentamos importantes desafíos. Tenemos el deber de poner fin a la cultura del silencio y la impunidad en torno a los ataques contra las mujeres, actuando con todas las herramientas y recursos de los que disponemos como Estado, y haciendo que los responsables de la violencia de género rindan cuentas ante la justicia. Los efectos de la pandemia en nuestro país han impactado en el acceso a los derechos de otros grupos en situación de vulnerabilidad. Las niñas y los niños, las personas afrodescendientes, los migrantes, las personas con capacidad y los pueblos indígenas, entre ellos. En el caso de las personas mayores, la pandemia ha remarcado la necesidad de contar con un instrumento de protección universal que sea jurídicamente vinculante. La Argentina continuará trabajando en el plano nacional y en el plano internacional para erradicar la discriminación y asegurar el pleno goce de los derechos de los grupos vulnerables. Durante el año 2020, reafirmamos nuestro compromiso de garantizar los derechos de las personas LGBTI. Hemos podido cumplir con demandas históricas en mi país, como el cupo laboral para personas trans, travestis y transexuales. Esta medida busca reparar la desigualdad estructural que históricamente ha sufrido este colectivo, brindando herramientas concretas para su inclusión. Señor presidente, las múltiples acciones de la República Argentina en materia de derechos humanos tienen como piedra fundacional nuestro propio proceso de memoria, verdad y justicia. El mismo que hizo posible erradicar la impunidad con los crímenes de lesa humanidad cometidos durante la última dictadura cívico-militar. Desde la recuperación de la democracia, la sociedad argentina ha impulsado de forma sostenida una agenda de igualdad y ampliación de derechos, sin exclusiones ni discriminaciones. Esta gesta, que contó con la contribución inestimable de nuestras abuelas y madres de Plaza de Mayo, hizo de la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos como política de Estado una parte esencial de nuestra identidad como miembros de la comunidad internacional. Tenemos el orgullo de haber colaborado activamente con el desarrollo progresivo de los derechos humanos, impulsando iniciativas que han permitido luchar contra la desaparición forzada de personas. Han permitido también velar por el derecho a la verdad y promover el uso de genética forense en el campo de los derechos humanos. Aprovecho esta oportunidad para hacer un llamado a todos los países a que adhieran a la Convención Internacional para la Protección de todas las personas contra la desaparición forzada. Acabamos de lanzar junto a Francia una nueva campaña global para promover la universalización de esta convención. La convención es una muestra del compromiso de la comunidad internacional con el fortalecimiento del sistema universal de protección de los derechos humanos. Esperamos poder continuar aportando a estos desarrollos y también a la labor del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Y en ese contexto esperamos contar con el apoyo de los estados presentes a nuestra candidatura para el periodo 2022-2024, en estas elecciones que próximamente tendrán lugar. Señor presidente, finalmente estamos convencidos de que el examen periódico universal tiene un rol primordial como mecanismo interpares universal. En tal sentido, la Argentina continuará participando constructivamente para dotar al EPU de mayor capacidad transformadora, buscando asegurar el diálogo y promoviendo la cooperación técnica para todos los estados que la requieran. Valoramos fuertemente el trabajo de la alta comisionada para los derechos humanos y apoyamos las acciones que con tanto compromiso realiza su oficina. Y hemos dado muestras durante el año de este apoyo, claramente, en todos los lugares en donde lo pudimos hacer. Nuestro país mantiene una invitación abierta y permanente a todos los procedimientos especiales de este Consejo. Creemos, en definitiva, que el Consejo de Derechos Humanos debe seguir desempeñando un rol fundamental para motorizar el diálogo entre países, para acercar posiciones y para intercambiar experiencias, evitando la polarización o la estigmatización y promoviendo en su lugar una mayor cooperación internacional. Nuestra historia nos ha enseñado que ese es el único camino posible. Ese es nuestro compromiso, también con este Consejo de Derechos Humanos.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Georgi Radulovic, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Montenegro. Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner for Human Rights, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates. I'm pleased to address you today on behalf of the government of Montenegro. At the outset, I wish to congratulate Madam Nazat Shamin Khan on her election as the President of the 15th Human Rights Council cycle. Madam President, we are confident that under your strong leadership, the Council will continue to fulfill its important mission in these challenging times. Further on, I would also like to express our gratitude to the former President, Madam Elizabeth Tichy-Filsberger, for her dedicated work and successful completion of all 3 HRC regular sessions, despite the financial constraints and COVID-19 crisis that continues to challenge all of us. Finally, allow me to congratulate Madame Michelle Bachelet and her office's leading role in addressing challenges that the pandemic has been posing to all of our societies. Montenegro appreciates your actions in keeping the focus on the importance of protection and promotion of human rights worldwide. Montenegro welcomes the announcement of the United States of America to rejoin Human Rights Council as an observer, thereby reaffirming its commitment to this important UN body and the role it has in the system of human rights at a global level. Today, we face an unprecedented global crisis that spills over into all segments of our lives. Economic and social impact of the pandemics is still impossible to fully comprehend. What is particularly alarming is that the current crisis has further demonstrated fragility of human rights, especially the vulnerable groups, and the urgent need for the additional actions in their protection. Our success in dealing with all these adversities depends on how willing we are to work together. Solidarity and a sense of common purpose should be a driving force behind all our actions in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences. Montenegro strongly believes that principles supporting and promoting human rights, democracy, and rule of law should remain at the heart of all activities, plans, and policies for effective crisis governance and recovery. Therefore, we welcome the development of policies that provide universal and equal access to social and health care, which should now, more than ever, be demonstrated in the fight against the current health crisis, enabling the main tool in this fight, the vaccine, to be available to all on equal terms. Madam President, in these exceptional circumstances, the role of Human Rights Council is even more important. HRC needs to remain a crucial human rights mechanism at the global level, capable of addressing all the major crises, thus accelerating its preventive role. Therefore, Montenegro advocates for strengthening the visibility, efficiency, and financial sustainability of the HRC in the UN system in general. We continuously confirm our commitment to the human rights agenda by actively participating in the work of the Council, as well as in all sessions of the UPR. We wish to further strengthen our contribution also through active membership in this important body, which is why we have submitted our candidacy for the period 2022-2024. Montenegro remains strongly committed to strengthening the UN human rights system and will continue to provide strong support for the preservation of integrity, independence, and functionality of the OHCHR, what we have also reconfirmed by increasing our voluntary national contribution to 10,000 euros. We recognize the important role and contribution of NGOs, human rights defenders, and other civil society stakeholders to the human rights mechanisms, and we support their active participation and interaction. Montenegro strongly condemns the continuation of massive, systematic, and widespread human rights violations, which include attacks on civilians, journalists, and human rights defenders. These violations demand our determined reaction to bring the perpetrators to justice, and impunity is not an option. Therefore, we consider it important to advance cooperation with the ICC and other criminal tribunals and fully implement obligations of the Rome Statute. Ladies and gentlemen, Montenegro is continuously working to improve the institutional and legislative framework in the field of human rights and continues to cooperate openly with OHCHR special procedures and mechanisms. Montenegro's priorities in the Human Rights Council are an integral part of the European agenda, which focuses on the rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. The reforms we are implementing in the EU accession process are complementary to achieving the 2030 development goals, while almost 2/3 of the SDG targets are covered in this way. We remain committed to creating equal conditions and opportunities for all and are committed to strengthening the fight against all forms of discrimination. We are continuously implementing reforms to achieve gender equality and eliminate all forms of violence against women, reduce social exclusion and discrimination, to promote and protect rights of the LGBTI persons, migrants and displaced persons, Roma and minorities, persons with disabilities, etc. Montenegro has been recognized through the report Realizing Rights, Challenging Lives, the Impact of the UN Human Rights System on the Enjoyment of Child Rights as one of the 6 most successful in terms of exercising the rights of the child. We are constantly working to ensure media freedom and freedom of expression. We are aware of our achievements, but also of the challenges and further tasks in terms of improving the protection of human rights. More work needs to be done. We will stay committed to achieve the set goals and to overcome the existing shortcomings and gaps. Thank you very much for your attention.
شكرا جزيلا. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Heiko Maas, Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany. Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to stand still means to lose ground. This is all too true for human rights. We are witnessing every day that we cannot take human rights for granted. In many places, journalists and activists who voice criticism are detained. We see discrimination and persecution based on ethnicity, religion, and gender. In armed conflicts worldwide, parties violate human rights every second of every day. The members of this council have been elected to counter such dangerous trends. If we don't hold the ground on human rights, we will lose the ground that our international community is built on. Ladies and gentlemen, this quest for human rights starts at home for all of us. In Germany, we have stepped up efforts to counter racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. But more still needs to be done to build a truly inclusive, fair, and equal society for all of our citizens. And in the European Union, we have recently adopted a human rights sanctions regime, because those who trampled on human rights have no right to enjoy their holidays in European capitals or to park their money in our banks. To hold our ground on human rights also means keeping up with new challenges. Climate change increasingly threatens human rights. We are working to address this issue in all United Nations bodies and in the Alliance for Multilateralism. The digital revolution and new technologies create human progress, but also risks. Hate speech is triggering violence. Artificial intelligence can worsen discrimination. Protecting freedom of speech, human dignity, and privacy in the digital age should therefore remain at the top of our agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, tackling these challenges requires a stronger United Nations human rights architecture, with the Human Rights Council at its core. This is especially true in times of a global pandemic that also poses threats to human rights. And that is why Germany will increase its voluntary contribution to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights by almost 50% to $11.5 million this year. We continue advocating a closer link between the Human Rights Council and the Security Council. Sustainable peace depends on respect for human rights. And we welcome the renewed commitment of the United States to this council. Ladies and gentlemen, there has been much criticism of the composition of the Human Rights Council after last year's election. On the one hand, different perspectives trigger debates and lead to better outcomes. And inclusiveness strengthens the Council's credibility. But let me be clear. Different cultural backgrounds or national perspectives cannot be an excuse for member states to hamper the Council's work. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Every state, especially those elected to this Council, is bound to defend this commitment and the other 29 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is why this Council was right in speaking up on the overthrow of a democratically elected government in Myanmar. Our commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also leaves no room for the arbitrary detention of ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs in Xinjiang or China's crackdown on civil liberties in Hong Kong. We must speak up against severe violations of civil liberties in places like North Korea and Syria. And we have to highlight the growing restrictions imposed on civil society, whether in Iran, Venezuela, or elsewhere. And we will not be silent when peaceful protesters and opposition leaders are attacked and imprisoned, as has occurred in Belarus or Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, protecting human rights means putting those who suffer from violations at the center of our efforts. That is why we have launched a program sponsoring short-term stays of human rights defenders in Germany and other places. It allows them to get out of the line of fire, at least for a while. And as a member of the Security Council in the last 2 years, we invited a record number of briefers from the civil society, most of them women. They confronted the Council with their first-hand experiences of conflict and violence. And we are committed to making their voices heard, here in the Human Rights Council as well. Madam President, Germany looks forward to working with you and with all our fellow members on this Council to respond to new challenges, to advance human rights, and to stand our ground. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. الآن يشرفني أن أعطي الكلمة للسيد إيفاريست بارتولو وزير الخارجية والشؤون الأوروبية لمالطا. معاليك لك الكلمة.
Madam President, High Commissioner, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. For the first time in its history, a small island Pacific state is heading the Human Rights Council, a body which is fundamental for international dialogue to advance and protect human rights as the UN's main intergovernmental body responsible for human rights. I would like to congratulate Ambassador Nazat Shamim Khan, permanent representative of Fiji, on her election as President of the Human Rights Council for 2021, and wish her well for her term in office. Madam President, we are living in challenging times. For over 12 months, the world grappled to bring the COVID-19 pandemic under control, which has caused immense suffering and hardship across all continents. It has highlighted critical human rights aspects linked to the rights to life and death, international cooperation, and more solidarity among nations. Also, when it comes to vaccine distribution, where you live should not be the reason whether you live. At the same time, we have witnessed an increasing erosion in respect for human rights, heightening broader concerns over worldwide democratic backsliding in recent years. We continue to be inspired by the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, whose overarching principles point to ways in which we can transform hope into concrete action. In the circumstances, we believe that member states need to engage more, not less, within the multilateral system, including with this body. In this spirit, Malta warmly welcomes the re-engagement of the United States of America with the Human Rights Council. Madam President, putting into practice the Council's preventative mandate and prerogative is crucial. There is much work to be done in terms of reaching global solidarity on migration and preventing more tragedies and loss of human lives in the Mediterranean. I have stated before that no country, no matter its size, can unilaterally solve the problem of irregular migration. We should keep on making the basic point that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is universal. It was formulated after the catastrophe of the Second World War by persons coming from different civilizations and political systems, and all agreed that we are one world and a common humanity, and we should feel the pain and suffering wherever the person is and whoever he, she is. Respect for freedom of expression, assembly, and the right to enjoy one's culture has nothing to do with borders and political systems. Making this point cannot be dismissed as interfering in internal affairs. At the same time, we should defend and promote human rights everywhere and not be selective, and should avoid using double standards and attack only those governments which is convenient for us to attack. Weaponizing human rights undermines them and benefits nobody. Each individual state has the responsibility to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Furthermore, Malta continues to condemn the application of the death penalty and calls on countries still applying it to abolish it, or at a minimum, introduce a moratorium as a first step towards full and legal abolition. Madam President, the full realization of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by women and girls, as well as their empowerment, is a priority for my government. We plan to shortly present a bill to commence a gender quota in Parliament. Around the world, women journalists and human rights defenders continue to be targeted. I concur with what many special procedures mandate holders and civil society organizations have been maintaining over the past months, that the COVID-19 crisis cannot be solved with public health and emergency measures only. The Council has made important strides in identifying the causes of violence and discrimination against people due to their gender identity and sexual orientation. Malta will continue to place a special emphasis on promoting at the UN the human rights of LGBTIQ persons, and domestically through the implementation of the LGBTIQ Equality Strategy and Action Plan for 2018-2022. I was pleased to see that for the 5th year in a row, ILGA Europe Rainbow Organization has ranked Malta first from the 49 countries assessed. As the world increasingly takes stronger positions against racial injustice, Malta recently inaugurated a hate crime and speech unit, which will be tasked with supporting victims of racially based hate crime and hate speech, offline and online, through the provision of free therapeutic and legal services. We are also in the process of formulating our first national action against racism and xenophobia. Madam President, Malta is committed to ensuring the safety of journalists and that all those involved in Daphne Caruana Galizia's murder are brought to justice. The investigation is ongoing. The judicial process has started for those who allegedly carried out the assassination and also for the alleged mastermind. The fight against impunity remains crucial, also with regards to reprisals and intimidation against those cooperating with the United Nations. We should use all available tools to fulfill our commitments to human rights, including in the HRC, General Assembly, and the UN Security Council. As part of Malta's bid for a seat on the United Nations Security Council in 2023-2024, we have stepped up our efforts to commit to the Women, Peace and Security agenda by launching our first national action plan and appointing our first ambassador. I stress the importance of the protection of the rights of the child, including their right to education. In the words of the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, education is a human right with immense power to transform. On its foundation rests the cornerstones of freedom, democracy, and sustainable human development. Children should not bear the brunt of conflicts and be used as instruments of war. Malta will continue to work through the UN to address violations against the rights of children in armed conflicts. Madam President, in closing, I would like to convey my government's appreciation for High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet and her office, and call on all states to respect her independence, to cooperate for the effective delivery of her mandate, and to ensure adequate financing. Global challenges such as climate change, migration, and cybersecurity all have important human rights implications. Member states need to engage more, not less, within the multilateral system, including with this body. Looking ahead, Malta underlines that all UN members, especially HRC members, should uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights and fully cooperate with the Council and its mechanisms. My message for the Council in 2021 is one of determination to face our common challenges with one objective. A multilateral approach is our best guarantee that global issues are tackled head-on for our mutual benefit. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. الآن يشرفني أن أعطي الكلمة لفخامة كاترين إجنبرجر وزيرة الخارجية والعدل والثقافة لليختنشتاين. فخامة الوزيرة لك الكلمة.
Madam President, Excellencies, colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to address the Human Rights Council, even though I would have preferred to be in Geneva right now and meeting you all in person. We were pleased to see that the Council managed to function throughout the last year, fulfill its program of work, notably as the only UN body. This was only possible due to the tremendous efforts by former President of the Council, Ambassador Elisabeth Tichy-Fisselberger from Austria and her team. We are also very pleased to see Ambassador Nasat Khan from Fiji to have the presidency of the Council for 2021. During the COVID-19 pandemic, existing inequalities have further exacerbated. We are concerned about the negative impact of the pandemic on women and children, who have been more exposed to domestic violence as a result of the measures taken to address the pandemic. Under the current circumstances, it is important that we show flexibility in the modalities of the Council in order to keep it running. Liechtenstein, together with a large group of states, has led on a resolution to allow e-voting for the General Assembly in exceptional circumstances, when the Assembly is unable to meet in person for a prolonged period of time. As a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council may also apply that procedure. We encourage the President to keep this option in mind as we begin a new cycle. Madam President, together with Germany, Brazil, Mexico, and Austria, Liechtenstein will run a resolution at this session of the Human Rights Council to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy in the digital age. We are convinced that the situation of surveillance, the additional threats of artificial intelligence, machine learning, tracking, and profiling will only increase the importance of the Council addressing this issue. Liechtenstein will continue to stress the importance of accountability for serious human rights violations and violations of international law, in particular when it comes to the most serious crimes. The current situation of the pandemic also created difficult challenges for dedicated mechanisms such as the IIIM, and we were very pleased to see that they found creative ways to continue their important work, while underscoring that this should not be precedents for their functioning. We are appalled by the recent removal of the civilian government in Myanmar by the military, as the coup represents a clear danger of additional escalation of the already serious pre-existing human rights crisis in Myanmar. Liechtenstein calls upon the Myanmar military to immediately lift the state of emergency and release all arbitrarily detained persons. Independent investigations into all human rights violations need to be ensured. The proceedings of the ICC, albeit on a limited set of crimes in the absence of a Security Council referral, continue to be the most promising pathway to criminal accountability in Myanmar, alongside full cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and with the Human Rights Council and its mandate holders, in particular the IIM. We are furthermore concerned about the situation in Syria, as the conflict faces a sad 10-year anniversary. Liechtenstein continues to call on the government of Syria and other states to fully cooperate with the international, impartial, and independent mechanism for Syria, the IIIM, and reiterates its principled position that the situation in Syria should be referred to the ICC by the Security Council. There is no sustainable future for Syria without justice for the countless atrocities committed and still ongoing. We are concerned about the recent wave of arbitrary arrests, allegations of torture, and the closure of civic space in Belarus in the aftermath of the presidential elections in summer 2020, which were neither free nor fair. We call on the government of Belarus to immediately stop the violence against peaceful protesters and thoroughly investigate all allegations, to release arbitrarily arrested people, bring perpetrators of human rights violations to justice, and fully cooperate with the Human Rights Council and the OSCE. Madam President, it is my pleasure to inform the Human Rights Council about progress made by Liechtenstein in the implementation of international human rights treaties. On 8 September 2020, we have signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and are preparing for its ratification. Moreover, Liechtenstein is currently finalizing the preparatory work concerning the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. In the course of the ratification process, a further strengthening of the protection of victims and witnesses of gender-based, sexual, and domestic violence in civil rights procedures is planned. Before concluding, please let me touch upon one issue that is important for Liechtenstein and also for me personally. Liechtenstein strongly believes that civil society actors are key players in ensuring that the Human Rights Council can fulfill its mandate. Liechtenstein is very concerned about the increasing attacks and reprisals, both online and offline, against human rights defenders in many countries, as well as against individuals and groups seeking to cooperate or having cooperated with the United Nations. In particular, we are concerned of the use of COVID-19 measures to silence civil society actors. All this is unacceptable. We strongly condemn any reprisals against civil society and its representatives under any circumstances. Last but not least, I would like to express our support to you, Madam President. Liechtenstein will, in its national capacity and its capacity as the coordinator of the WEOG group for 2021, stand ready to work constructively with you. I thank you.
شكرا. الآن يشرفني أن أعطي الكلمة للسيد ألان جنوم وزير الخارجية التكامل الإقليمي والتجارة الدولية لجمهورية موريشيوس. الكلمة لك معالي الوزير.
For Human Rights, Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a matter of immense pleasure and honor for me to address this august assembly for the first time since I have assumed office as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mauritius. Allow me at the very outset to congratulate you, Ambassador Khan, on your election as President of the Human Rights Council for the 15th cycle. Mauritius looks forward to working with you and other members of the Council to strengthen the human rights dialogue. Madam President, the promotion and protection of human rights is of utmost importance to Mauritius. And in our Constitution, a number of provisions have been enshrined to ensure that our citizens are able to exercise effectively their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, irrespective of their race, place of origin, political opinions, color, creed, or sex. This commitment saw us become one of the founding members of the Human Rights Council. The values, aspiration, and ethos of the Council are very much present in our national policies as they continue to guide us in having a right-based approach. It is against this backdrop that Mauritius will shortly be promulgating the Children's Bill, which brings together different pieces of legislation dealing with children under one legislative umbrella. The bill will allow us to better administer frameworks to protect our children, for we should not forget that children have rights that cater for their specific needs, in addition to enjoying the same general rights as adults. Our children are the future of our country, and the protection of their rights should be our priority. Two important aspects of this act are the enforcement of the minimum age of marriage to 18 years and setting age of criminal responsibility to 14 years, in line with recommendations set at the UN and African Union. Together with the Children's Bill, we will also shortly promulgate the Child Sex Offender Register Bill, which will establish a register with a view to reducing and preventing the risk of sexual offenses against children. To supplement these two legislation, a children's court will be created to enable the expedient administration and delivery of justice to the children of Mauritius. These landmark legislations have taken into account international yardsticks of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and have successfully integrated and entrenched the four cardinal principles of the best interest of the child, the non-discrimination against the child, the survival and development of the child, and the right of the child to be heard. They will make of Mauritius a better and safer place for our children. Madam President, Excellencies, today, as we reaffirm the need to strengthen our human rights approach, we are challenged by two external variables, invisible threats, and common enemies to our present: the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. While they have both affected our enjoyment of rights, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been more immediate and visible. As I speak, more than 100 million people have been affected by the pandemic, with more than 2 million casualties. Millions of jobs have been lost. Restriction in movement of people and a rise in domestic violence has been experienced. We still face major threats to the access of food, health, medication, and the pandemic has taken over many of our priorities. We have witnessed individual interests taking over the common benefit of mankind. The pandemic is feared by all socioeconomic actors of the globe and has put a sudden end to a period of 10 years of sustained growth since the 2008 financial crisis. While this terrorizing pandemic is unprecedented, we surely know that this will surely not be the last. This is the reason why we should all come together to build a resilient system which prioritizes human dignity, diversity, and equality. I would like to use this opportunity to thank the COVAX initiative, which is working to accelerate the development and manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines and guarantee its fair and equitable access for every country in the world. We need to ensure the vaccination of all people in our world to avoid the risk of further mutations of the virus. In this respect, Mauritius supports the proposal made by India and South Africa at the WTO for a temporary waiver of certain TRIPS obligations in response to COVID-19. We believe the waiver will ensure better affordability and accessibility of vaccines and therapeutics to populations. Human rights and the sanctity of health and life cannot be overridden by commercial or other distribution access considerations, particularly in times of global pandemic. While we respect intellectual property laws, a temporary waiver as prescribed by the WTO laws will help achieve the universal access to health, especially for small economies and LDCs. Madam President, on the other hand, the impact of climate change are long-lasting. Not only SIDS like Mauritius, but all economies, small or big, are facing the impacts of climate change, ranging from the extended periods of droughts in South Africa and Namibia to the bushfires in Australia and hurricanes like Irma. Internal and international displacement arising due to climate change, threat to food security, threat to education and schools as witnessed in the Pacific, have been ignored for way too long. As such, we appreciate the re-engagement of world leaders in the climate dialogue in Mauritius. Therefore, warmly welcome the return of the United States of America to the Paris Agreement, and we are confident that such unity of the international community will enable us to meet our non-discriminatory obligations towards our people. As one of the main sponsors of the Resolution 1910 on the human rights and environment, Mauritius continues to pursue the agenda of putting people first in order to achieve the right to food, the right to decent living, and the right to safe, healthy, and sustainable environment. It is in this spirit that the government of Mauritius has promulgated the Climate Change Act with a view to have a greener economy and meet our obligations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. Madam President, we regret till today that our citizens, including women and girls, were forcefully displaced from the Chagos Archipelago, a territory of the Republic of Mauritius. Despite judgments of the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, recognizing the sovereignty of Mauritius, our citizens cannot, till now, rightfully exercise their rights to return and their right to live where they rightfully belong from. I would just like to make an appeal to the international community to continue support the process of decolonization of Mauritius. Madam President, the road ahead of us is not easy. We are climbing a mountain without any knowledge of its height. However, I am confident that with cooperation at all levels, we shall provide our people with the rights they deserve. I assure you of the continued support of my delegation to the work of the Council. I wish you all a very successful and fruitful 46th session. Thank you.
Shukran jazilan. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jep Kofod, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mrs. President, Excellencies, colleagues, the global pandemic has highlighted the importance of multilateral cooperation, the importance of human rights, and the importance of this Council's responsibility to uphold all human rights for everyone. As Council members, we must adhere and aspire to the highest human rights standards. Membership must never be a shield against critique. Rather, the Council must be a watchdog over human rights violations wherever they may occur. Mrs. President, let me highlight a few specific country situations of great concern while also referring to the Danish statement under the relevant Council agenda items. In Belarus, our continued calls on the authorities to immediately cease all violence have gone unanswered. Nevertheless, all perpetrators of these grave human rights violations must be brought to justice and accountability must be ensured. In Russia, the human rights situation is continuously worsening. We urge the authorities to guarantee the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of speech and to release all peaceful protesters immediately. I strongly condemn the military coup in Myanmar. My message is clear. Release arrested leaders, restore civilian government, and respect human rights and the rule of law. Denmark stands with the people of Myanmar in their fight for democracy. Fundamental rights continue to be violated in Hong Kong, despite promises to protect human rights and to live up to legally binding international obligations. The implementation of a national security law goes well beyond question of national security. The EU and Denmark call on the authorities in China and in Hong Kong to allow democratic freedoms and right to be restored and peacefully exercised. In Ethiopia, concerns remain around allegations of human rights violations in Tigray. Denmark encourages and supports impartial and transparent investigations into these allegations to ensure accountability. Mrs. President, we see increasing violence regarding freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and freedom of information. We see attacks on human rights defenders and shrinking civil space. It is deeply worrying, which is why we have increased the Danish engagement to promote and enable space for civil society and protect human rights defenders. We need to preserve a safe, open, and interoperable internet based on the respect for human rights and international law. Only cooperation between states, tech companies, and civil society will solve the common challenge. The Danish strategy for technological diplomacy reaffirms our commitments to this work. Despite the absolute prohibition of torture, reports of the use of torture persist. Denmark continue this fight and present a resolution on the role of responsibility of police and law. We stand firm on women and girls' rights to decide over their life, body, and future. We will never tolerate going back on years of gains, and we must include women and girls when we build back from COVID-19. To this end, I'm proud that we co-lead the SRHR Action Coalition. Mrs. President, we remain deeply committed to human rights and look forward to our last year as member of this very important council. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dominic Raab, First Secretary of State and Secretary of Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, the UK places the promotion and protection of human rights at the very top of our list of international priorities. So we're very pleased to return to the Human Rights Council, and we will continue to uphold and defend the international rule of law and the rights and freedoms of people right around the world. We place a particular focus on championing freedom of religion and belief, defending media freedom, and also championing the values of liberal democracy. We will use all of the diplomatic and development levers available to us to pursue these ends, support states to meet their human rights obligations, and uphold the values on which the United Nations was founded. The Human Rights Council has a key role to play. And at this moment, when we see the democratic dominoes falling across the world, when we see appalling human rights violations, and when we see some governments using COVID as a pretext to row back on personal freedoms, this Council's role is even more important than ever. But like any institution, we know the Council's not perfect. Some members don't meet the human rights standards we vow to uphold, and the Council's agenda doesn't consistently reflect where the most pressing human rights issues are. We need to address that, as well as other institutional concerns. For our part, the UK will continue to engage with all sides to find ways to do so. For example, we must find ways to reduce the practical barriers to small island developing states engaging fully. This Council lives up to its best traditions of the United Nations when it shines a spotlight on the very worst violations of human rights and demands accountability for those responsible. So let me highlight some of the most pressing human rights situations that we see today. The position in Myanmar gets worse. The violations and abuses are well documented, including arbitrary detention and draconian restrictions on freedom of expression. And that crisis presents an increased risk to the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities. That's why the UK and the EU led a special session of the Council on this issue earlier in the month. It resulted in a consensus resolution demonstrating the strength of feeling in the Council about the actions of the military. The UK has also led strong statements from the G7 and the UN Security Council condemning the situation. The UK is sanctioning individuals for serious human rights violations that took place during the coup. The military must step aside, civilian leaders must be released, and the democratic wishes of the people of Myanmar must be respected. That's why at this session, we will again co-sponsor the resolution renewing the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar so he can continue his essential work. Let me now turn to Belarus. Last year's rigged presidential elections and Mr. Lukashenko's brutal crackdown against those calling for change has resulted in a human rights crisis. There is no other way to describe it. The UK has been at the vanguard of the international response. This includes an OSCE investigation, an urgent debate at the Council in September, and greater support for civil society and the independent media. With Canada, we acted decisively in implementing sanctions against Lukashenko and his inner circle. Now, this Council must continue with a comprehensive investigation of human rights violations, including accusations of torture, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. The Belarusian authorities must stop their campaign of repression, agree to meaningful dialogue, and now hold new elections. The UK will support initiatives to keep Belarus on the Council's agenda for as long as it is necessary, and until the Belarusian people are able to enjoy their democratic rights and their fundamental freedoms. Now, turning to Russia, where we face a truly dire and shocking situation from a permanent member of the UN Security Council.